I'm going to start on time tonight. There are a lot of people here. Thank you for coming on time, so let's get going. I'm Mike Ehrmann, President of the Squirrel Hill Historical Society. You'll hear from me later more. I want to introduce the members of the leadership of this organization who work on your behalf. Betty Connolly, Vice President. Helen Wilson, Vice President. Audrey Glickman in the back doing at the camera. Jim Hammond is here. Toby Chapman is here. We've got Ralph Lund here. We've got Gene Beanstalk in the back. And let me go around and see if I've got any more. Wade Bossinger is here, our other board member. We're a voluntary organization, depend on membership dues, which are tax deductible. We're in the middle of a membership drive. We've done very well the last couple of years, but we want to keep expanding. So please, please join if you're interested. And some of you have been buying our books. The other thing I want to talk about tonight is that you have sheets, or most of you have sheets about meetings in January, February, and March. I want to go over them. We have monthly meetings. I will be gone for the winter, and Helen Wilson will be available to run these meetings. Helen will also speak in January. Many of you have had her classes and heard her speak about our book, but she has Squirrel Hill History Volume 10 to talk about in January. New insights on Squirrel Hill history. In February, Charlie McCollum, who has spoken to us before on a very different subject, is going to come talk about the Gertie family and other doings around the beginnings of Pittsburgh. Samuel Gertie is an interesting fellow. You should come and hear the crazy story. He lived around here, and then he worked with the British. And finally, he was a persona non grata after the Revolutionary War, and had he fled to Ontario. We have recently participated in an activity to put a new state historic plaque up on Beechwood. It just went up recently, and it's there, and you'll see it as you go by. So that's Charlie in February and March. That's Rourke, who we call the saint of this organization because she got our first photographic collection together a long time ago for the first book, which is one of those available. She is an art historian at Chatham. She's going to talk about an interesting subject. She's going to take a statue that's in the cemetery in Lawrenceville and talk about, in Allegheny Cemetery, and talk about its implications for the styles of art that it represents, but also art collecting in Pittsburgh in the 19th century.
Oh, that's
so
great.
We have a nice variety of things. I almost forgot. Starting next week, I had hoped to have it tonight. Those of you who will go on to squirrelhillhistory.org will find an entirely revamped website. I wanted to inaugurate it tonight. We've had a few glitches, but by the weekend, you should see, and we hope you like, a new thing. Finally, over there, two drawings. One that was handed out when the new Greenfield Bridge was inaugurated. And who was the Helen? Who was the donation of the?
Harvey Eisler donated the other drawing. It's the I forget what the storefront is. It's an architectural drawing of
Charles Spiegel.
What is it?
Charles
Spiegel. Thanks.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Last year, Barbara Burstin came to speak to us the second or third time in front of this group. Barbara's a member, is a professor of Jewish studies at both CMU and Pittsburgh, is a resident expert of Pittsburgh Jewish life, has written a number of books. And there was so much to say that we asked Barbara to come back and talk some more tonight. So Barbara's going to start with a more general picture of what she didn't talk about last time. I'll leave that to her. And then I'll come up and tell you a unique story of my own family's voyage to the U.S. with a little add-on from one of our members whose family also came over from one of the cities where my family came from. So we have a nice mixture of things tonight. Barbara, come on up.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? This is working, right? No? Okay, I gotta talk like this. Okay, so I'm kind of setting the scene for refugees coming over to Pittsburgh in the 1930s. And I guess to start that, we need to look at the legislation that's on the books concerning immigration and refugees. And to do that, we need to go back to 1924, because in 1924, an act was finalized, known as the Johnson-Reed Act. Mr. Reed was the senator from Pittsburgh, David Reed, of the firm of Reed Smith, right? And he was concerned that Pittsburgh, that not just Pittsburgh, but America was going to fall like the Roman Empire had fallen. And the reason it was going to fall was because of all the immigrants who were coming into this country from Southern and Eastern Europe. He was convinced that those people would not be able to assimilate into American life, that they were basically, their genes, their race was counter to American ideals and our gene pool. In other words, he was a racist, prejudiced, because most of those people coming in from Southern and Eastern Europe were not white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. They were primarily Catholics with 2.5 million Jews. This was clearly, in his mind and in the mind of the Congress at the time, totally unacceptable. And so in 1924, an act was passed where basically the welcome mat that had been available to immigrants coming to America was taken away. And immigration was restricted to 150,000, about 150,000 people per year, in contrast to the hundreds of thousands who had been coming in at the early 20th century. And I bet if we did a quick, in fact, let me do that. How many of you, raise both hands, representing both sides of your family, how many of you had your ancestors come to this country between 1880 and 1924? Raise your hand. Okay, I rest my case. Out of all of you, how many of you are either of Catholic or Jewish descent? Okay, well, we don't like your kind. Okay, you're verboten. You're not acceptable. And so this act is passed. It's on the books in 1924, and understand not only are the total number of immigrants allowed into this country, but we're specifying who they are, okay? So half of those immigrants have to come from where? Tell me where you think.
Great Britain.
Great Britain, okay? Which means that only 75,000 is divided up among the other areas of Europe. If we look at the German Austria quota, it's about 27,000 because they're Aryans. They're certainly a little more highly distinguished than the Southern and Eastern Europeans. Italians only get a couple of thousand, from Russia only a couple of thousand, Poland, so forth, Eastern Europe. So when we begin to look at the 1930s, we need to understand what's on the books. And we also need to understand that there's no differentiation between an immigrant just coming for an opportunity to better themselves and a refugee who is escaping with their life, okay? In 1929, adding to the congressional legislation, in 1929, when the Depression hits, or starts to hit, a LPC clause is adopted. Anybody know what LPC might stand for? Anybody who is likely to become a public charge is not allowed into this country. So you have some very rigorous barriers already before Hitler comes to power in 1933. The legislation on the books then in the 1920s has absolutely nothing to do with Hitler. It has to do with the reaction, the backlash to all the immigrants who have been coming in between 1880 to 1920 or so. So that's what I need to tell you. And when you look at the actual immigration figures, you will see that even the quotas that were established were not filled throughout the 30s, because it was nobody's responsibility. The State Department, any of you who have studied anything about the history of the State Department, was filled with people who, shall we say, were very unsympathetic to Jews and Catholics coming into this country. And it simply wasn't in their job description to be humanitarians, to open up the doors for refugees, for people who were desperate. So you had the quotas, even for Germany, being filled just a couple of thousand versus 27,000, and certainly for the people coming from Eastern Europe, even less willingness to admit them. And to get to this country, it's different than it is today. To get to this country, you had to go to the State Department official, the consular official overseas, and get permission. And the documents, if I were just to show you some of the documents required for immigration, you needed a visa application, 5 copies, you needed 2 copies of your birth certificate, you needed your quota number because you were assigned a quota, okay, because there was only limited numbers, so everybody who was coming in from that country was assigned a number. You needed 2 sponsors, close relatives were preferred. The sponsors must be American citizens or have permanent resident status, and they must have filled out an affidavit of support and sponsorship, 6 copies notarized, as well as providing supporting documents, certified copy of recent federal tax return, affidavit from bank accounts, of your bank accounts, affidavit from any responsible person regarding other assets, etc. You needed a certificate of good conduct from the German police authorities, including 2 copies of a police dossier, prison record, military record, other government records. You needed affidavits of good conduct. You needed to pass a physical exam. You needed proof of permission to leave Germany. You get the picture how difficult it is. When Truman, after the war, in 1945, Truman established what was known as a corporate affidavit, which permitted a nonprofit refugee agency to sponsor a potential immigrant or refugee. But in the 30s, you had to have a close relative or friend who was going to vouch for you, who was going to make sure that you weren't going to become a public charge. And they needed to provide all kinds of financial records. So between the lack of willingness by the State Department to bend anything, to even fill the quotas, and the difficulty of getting a friend or a sponsor, especially during the Depression, who was going to swear, on an affidavit that they would take care of you, it was very difficult. So if we look at some of the figures, for instance, there were over 500,000 Jews in Germany in 1933 when Hitler came to power. They represented less than 1% of the population. I always play this game with students because we go over all the accusations that were made against Jews, and I say, all right, what do we bid? What percentage of the population is Jewish? And I get 20%, 30%, 50%. And unless somebody has done their homework, they think it's much higher. It actually was less than 1%. So out of the 500,000 Jews in 1933, about 340,000 emigrated, but about 100,000 of those emigrated to nearby European countries, and of course when Hitler invaded, they most likely were rounded up and killed. Not that many were able to get to the United States. For instance, in 1938, when it really hit the fan in terms of terror on the streets, Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, when Jewish stores and synagogues were burned, when you had what was called the Aryanization of property where Jewish businesses were simply taken over. You had 125,000 people literally lined up outside U.S. consulates in order to get 27,000 visas. By 1939, after Hitler had had annexed Austria and the Sudetenland, you had 309,000 Jews applying for 27,000 places. Quotas were not even filled before 1938. In 1938, Franklin Roosevelt insisted that the quotas be filled. I don't know if any of you have heard of the Evian Conference, which he called in order to get 32 nations, the free world, to respond to the refugee crisis, and there was simply very little response. But Roosevelt insisted that the quotas be filled, and in 1939 they were at least. Roosevelt also, because people are always interested in Franklin Roosevelt, right? Did he care? Did he do anything? Franklin Roosevelt certainly looked into places where Jews could be resettled. There's evidence that he talked to colleagues about that in South Africa, Latin America. Since the gates of America were closed. And he also thought about trying to petition Congress to change the immigration law on the books, the Johnson-Reed Act, but he was told that if this subject was brought up in Congress, given the sentiment in Congress and given the overwhelming sentiment in America, that if anything, Congress would not liberalize the laws. They would even close refugee immigration further. The American people, in light of the Depression, were overwhelmingly opposed to refugees coming to this country. There are a lot of parallels in contemporary times, unfortunately. But so that was the situation. And in 1939, if some of you might recall, you had two events that were devastating to Jews who were looking for a refuge, because the issue was you could get out of Germany. The gates were not closed in Germany until 1941. Of course, you couldn't take any property with you, but you could get out, and Hitler was actually encouraging it in hopes of stimulating more anti-Semitism in the countries that these Jews would go to. But in 1939, we had the Voyage of the Dam. It was a movie was made out of it. The St. Louis with 900 refugees who had left from Hamburg, Germany, were on their way, had quota numbers, but not immediately to enter the United States. Were supposed to stay in Cuba, waiting for their number to come up, the year to come up when they could get into the United States. And Cuba said no, and the ship actually waited outside the Miami harbor. Telegrams were sent to Roosevelt and others, and there was silence. It was silence, and the captain refused to take the people back to Germany, and as it turned out, the American Joint Distribution Committee, a philanthropic organization, was able to get people to disembark in Belgium and Holland, France, and England. Unfortunately, only the ones in England were really safe. That same May of 1939, as if the St. Louis wasn't enough of a symbol of the lack of response, Britain, who was in control of Palestine at the time, issued what was known as the White Paper of 1939, limiting the number of Jews that could get to Palestine. So that too is going to be closed as a potential refuge. So it's not a great time. But let me talk about, after 1939, the security issue is raised because war has broken out, and now the State Department is adding on another layer of opposition. They're saying that there might be spies sent in, German spies who were part of the Jewish immigration. So that's another reason to keep the Jewish immigration down. So let's look at Pittsburgh. because that's where we're coming to. Pittsburgh, at that time, the National Council of Jewish Women had organized a department known as the Service to the Foreign Born. It had been organized decades before to assist immigrants who were coming into this country. The director of it was an immigrant herself, a woman by the name of Zena Saul. And she was amazing, spoke all these different languages, and her job really was to help volunteers, arrange volunteers to help the refugees who were coming in, and to help people fill out the documents to bring in their relatives and so forth. She was really called an angel by any number of people. And of course, Michael came in, and we're going to hear his story, but you might know some of the others who came in as well in the 1930s. Walter Jacob, who of course was the rabbi at Rodef Sholem for many years and is now the emeritus rabbi at Rodef Sholem, was a young child and came in the 1930s. You had, and I saw this article, I forgot where I got it from, but I don't know if any of you have had your picture taken by Hans Jonas. Hans Jonas was also an immigrant into Pittsburgh. He came, according to his story, when the Nazi invaded Austria in 1938. My father lost everything, Jonas says. From the Dachau concentration camp where he was taken, his father urged his family to flee to Pittsburgh. They arrived in 1938, began to rebuild and arrange for the release of the father, who joined the family a year later. The father got a job in an East Liberty studio, and Hans, a high school student at the time, started photographing events and people. After a 2-year stint as an army photographer, he joined his father's studio in 1946, in quote-unquote here, in polluted two-shirt-a-day Pittsburgh. When Thomas Dewey was running for president in 1948, the campaign wanted the father to photograph him, but Hans's father was too expensive, and so they sent Hans, and he shot Dewey for 50 cents a frame, and so his career began. So that's Hans Jonas. I don't know if any of you have heard of the name Richard Karp. Richard Karp was a violinist with the Pittsburgh Symphony who had come. He had actually been a violinist with William Steinberg, who also was going to come to Pittsburgh, but after the war. William Steinberg was a German Jew who had an orchestra in Europe. Richard Karp took over after Steinberg left to form the orchestra in Israel, and but Karp got out also in 1938. He came here, he became a violinist, as I say, with the Pittsburgh Symphony, and he also was considered one of the major forces developing the Pittsburgh Opera. And I recently read, this has nothing to do with Pittsburgh, but I just found it interesting that Lyndon Johnson was very concerned about what was happening in Germany, and actually was able to get, as a congressman, actually able to get, from what my source said, as many as 100 people to safety here in the United States. So Lyndon Johnson's past is quite interesting. Anyway, so let me just tell you it, and of course some of the people I actually interviewed years ago, one of the men I interviewed wound up going to see Oliver Kaufman, who was at the Kaufman's department store, and Oliver Kaufman made the comment that he didn't know he had so many relatives, because everybody was citing him as a person to go to in Pittsburgh. In 1933 and 1934, the Service for Foreign Born helped over 200 individuals, and they made hundreds of follow-up visits. In addition, the service, Zena Saul, dealt with frantic appeals by friends and relatives and loved ones about what was happening in Germany, trying to track them down. Solomon Freehoff, who was the rabbi at Rodef Sholem at the time, tried to get refugee scholars. There was a special dispensation for intellectual scholars, and Solomon Freehoff tried to get some of these scholars from Germany, to go to Cincinnati, the Hebrew Union College there. His efforts were somewhat successful, but I also understand that CMU brought over a couple of professors who had been thrown out of universities in Germany. So the Federation had what was known as a vocational employment service to give these people, to train them, to get them jobs in Pittsburgh, to get them acclimated and productive. And the National Council of Jewish Women took about 10 women and tried to teach them how to be, train them to do cooking and baking for parties and so forth. But there was a backlash against refugees who were accused of taking jobs away from Americans in the Depression. And I brought in an article that I got from the Pittsburgh Press, and it says, "No refugees in local stores," because this became a real issue, not just in Pittsburgh, but in America. The allegation, the charge was made that these refugees, not only are they bad because they're Jewish and because they're not going to be good Americans, but the allegation, of course, that they're taking jobs away. So there was an investigation by the Better Business Bureau here in Pittsburgh to see whether this was indeed the case. And the committee reported to the Better Business Bureau that out of 8,000 full-time employees in stores, none were refugees. Of 3,600 part-time employees in various stores, only 7 were found to have been refugees and none are now employed. So the Bureau said, quote unquote, "It is our opinion that the simultaneous circulation of these rumors that Jews are taking jobs away from real Americans in every large city strongly suggests that subversive groups have inspired this whispering campaign in an attempt to stir racial prejudice and unrest." So Pittsburgh tried to do away with some of these, or at least poke holes through some of these allegations. So what about the refugees themselves? And of course Michael can talk more personally. No question that when they came, they felt the need for camaraderie, for support, for learning, to learn English. Many of them formed as young men, single men, they formed something called the Friendship Club. Don't get it confused with the Friendship Circle today, which is a totally different operation. They formed the Friendship Club, which had year-round activities. They took advantage of all kinds of free concerts. In fact, there was a whole program where if you had extra tickets, you would give them to the Friendship Club for them to distribute. There were religious services, social events, cultural things. And so this was a way of these German, especially the single German refugees who came without families, to kind of find some support. What about the attitude of the native Pittsburghers themselves? There was some disagreement among the people that I spoke to about how well these German Jews were received by the German Jews who were already here. One refugee felt that the jobs that they didn't get much help from the established longtime German Jews here in Pittsburgh, but that they were more likely to get help from the Polish and Russian Jews. Sometimes the criticism was from one of their refugees. And I want to read to you a quote here from what I wrote about the feelings that people had regarding these German Jews. And Michael, you can poke holes in this or not, but Betty Bernstein, for instance, who was a refugee, talked about how German refugees, Jews, used to brag that they owned a department store back in Germany when it really wasn't so. If they had a dachshund in Germany, by the time they got to the United States, it had become a St. Bernard. Longtime Pittsburgher Alice Grafner said the same thing about refugees, except she quipped that instead of a St. Bernard, it was now a Great Dane. While Sidney Hyman had applauded Rodef Sholem for reaching out to refugees, he also admitted that after a while, quote unquote, people got tired of the refugees all claiming to be a banker. Margie Balter laughed about that, but repeated the line about the refugees trying to portray themselves as former bankers when they really were selling eggs. Other Pittsburgh Jews believed that the German refugees felt that they were better than the Eastern European Jews already in Pittsburgh. Myrtle Fisher, who was the chair of the Service for Foreign-Born Committee, believed that German Jewish refugees were not happy with the second-hand items they were given, that they were not grateful for the help. Ernest Nachman, himself a refugee, noted that some refugees wanted more support from the Jewish Federation. On the other hand, one longtime Pittsburgher insisted that the German immigrants were ready to accept anything, and that it was the established German Jewish families in Pittsburgh who were not particularly welcoming. Bella Heppenheimer, a German refugee, lamented that, quote unquote, "I don't know what they had against us. That's why we had the Friendship Club. They didn't want to know what we had gone through." Otto Abraham, another refugee, agreed that the refugees were really not accepted by the Pittsburgh Jewish community, quote unquote, "but we were hardworking people and a lot of us made a real name for ourselves." And now let me have Michael come forward. Thank you.
Barbara's given me a lot of touch points for what I'm going to talk about, but also some real significant differences. And I think what we need to do is to go back to Germany and remember that Germany was a Jewish place in which many Jews didn't do much about their Judaism. There's a lot of talk, you've read about it, about assimilationism in German Judaism, much more than in Eastern Europe. Partially because they had better opportunities over time. Also, it was a smaller community, which probably meant that it was more a middle and upper middle income community than the Eastern European, the much larger Jewish communities in the East. So I'm going to tell you a story about a family that really didn't do much with their Judaism until their son came home. That's me. And and let's go back and start and show you my parents. Henry Walter Ehrmann on the left, and Claire Ursula Sachs Ehrmann on the right. And they're the stars of this little show that we're going to do tonight. That's me, and that's our daughter Tanya, and that's a picture in 1973 in New York City. My parents arrived in the U.S. in the late 1940s. Let's talk first about Henry, and I'm going to put up a map and show you some things. Henry grew up in Berlin. Okay, he grew up going to a French Huguenot school for 13 years. The Huguenots, you know, this Protestant sect that had to leave France, they set up this lycée, this school system in Berlin in the 1600s. By the 20th century, it was so well known that in the 1930s, which was a heyday of Judaism in Berlin, by the way, this school was known as the Jewish High School, because the Jewish families went looking for the best place they could send their kids, and that's where it was. So Henry goes to school, has 13 years of Latin, fluent in French and German, and goes off and gets a doctorate in law in a school called Freiburg University, which is not on the map, but is in the Black Forest. And he comes back, and he's looking forward to becoming an assistant judge. He's named an assistant judge. Now, Henry's dad had died when he was 3. His mom was a governess. There was no celebration whatsoever of Judaism in that household. 1933, an edict comes down right after Hitler takes over, says no more Jews in the German civil service. So suddenly Dad, working all the time with all the money to become a judge, no longer has a job. It's at that point that he gets to be a very heavy activist, anti-Nazi activist, which we'll talk about all through this little talk. So that was Dad. So now he's sitting there in 1933. He joins the Socialist Party. We don't know exactly what he did. He used to tell me that every once in a while he would have negotiations, not friendly ones, with the communists, the people who later took over East Germany, doing with different things in terms of the opposition to the Nazis in Berlin. In 1934, he was thrown in jail. He was thrown in a concentration camp called Orangeburg, which was near Berlin. You don't hear much about that camp because they didn't use it later. But an early camp, and his mom goes and bribes the Nazis, who are not very organized yet, gets him out of camp, and he hangs around Berlin literally for a few weeks, and then decides, was told that he better get the hell out of there, and flees over the Czech mountains to meet the Socialist International, which is now in exile in Prague. And we'll pick up his story in a few minutes because I want to catch up with my mom. But a couple of things about the non-Jewish Jewish family that Dad came from. Someone showed me a directory in Berlin of that family. Back in the 19th century, they'd been fur merchants. We don't know if they were religious then or not, but they were fur merchants, a traditional Jewish the profession back then. But then, Dad died. Dad's aunt and uncle, who I believe professed to their Judaism more than Dad did, they were sort of, you remember Saul Urach in New York, the impresario who used to do concerts? They were sort of the Saul Urachs of Berlin for classical music for many years. We still had some books about it. They all disappeared, during the Holocaust. All right, let's leave Dad in Prague for a few minutes. Warklop, Poland, now Breslau, Germany, is a Jewish family called Zaks. And by the way, the second part of this tonight is I'm going to have one of our members come up who, unlike my long voyage, came directly to Pittsburgh from Breslau. The family settled here. Correct, David?
No, my mother settled in England during the war. And
I,
then she came over from England. She spent the war years in England.
okay, England, then to here.
Yes.
Okay.
My father came directly from
Okay.
Potsdam to the United States.
We'll hear a little more from David in a little while. This family was religious in Breslau. Breslau, which was taken over in Poland, was the third largest Jewish community in Germany before the war. There was Berlin, I'm not sure what the second was, and then there was Breslau. Breslau's Jewish community totally wiped out, and of course it was turned over to Poland. But I've been told that the Zaks family, which is Mom's maiden name, that there's listed in Yad Vashem in Jerusalem 20 or more Zaks that perished during the Holocaust. And they were very active in the temple. My grandfather Max left Breslau to become a reporter. I don't know, went to some university in Germany, and then he became a reporter. He also became a socialist. And he went as a cub reporter to a town, do we have it up there? Bielefeld, Germany. Up there in the corner, it's in the province of Westphalia. You may have heard of it. And while he was there, he met my grandma-to-be, who was the one non-Jew in the four grandparents, who was on a picket line. She was in a spinning mill, and she was a labor organizer. Socialist writer, labor organizer get together, and they marry. Then Grandpa Max gets a job down in Dresden, Germany, which later became part of the East Zone, in Saxony, and had a very good career, becoming editor of the major socialist newspaper there, as well as being, I think, a provincial legislature for a while. He was also very socialist and very stubborn. And when the Nazis took over Dresden in about 1933, he was quickly thrown in jail. He got out once, but was told that he had to leave, and he didn't. And he was thrown back in jail and tortured to death in 1934, 1935, way before most of the stuff had even started, because the politics and the religion came together. He did, he was, as a socialist, he wasn't religious, but that didn't matter. It was all part of what was held against him. My mom, who was 17 at the time, had been very active in the socialist youth groups. She was told that she was about ready to be arrested. So she flees, literally on days' notice, to a place called Scheveningen, Holland. Scheveningen is the seacoast resort for The Hague, the capital of Holland, and she became a governess there for a couple of years. Had to get out, and this was before the Nazis had taken over Holland, and she was there, and then she had an interesting idea. She wanted to go fight in the Spanish Civil War. So she decides that she's going to go to Paris and then go to Spain. My father, meantime, the Socialist International decided to send him to Prague. He was fluent into Paris. He was fluent in French, and to be sort of a welcoming committee for socialist refugees that came into Paris. One of his prime catches was my mother. But he convinced her not to go to the Civil War and to go to Corsica on a honeymoon instead. And so that was 1936, 1937. So we got them there, and my parents would very happily have stayed in France. They always loved France. They went back there many times later. They were both fluent by then in French. And I think Dad was already doing some legal and political related research. But what happened? The Germans began to move into their occupation of France. Mm-hmm. Dad had already joined the French army. Before the occupation, that was a thing he had to do at his age. He was in the French army, Mom was staying in Paris. But then, as the occupation started, the French began to talk about turning over German nationals back to the Germans as part of looking good. And so Dad got thrown into an internment camp in a town in the middle of southwestern France called Montauban. It was a camp. It wasn't a concentration camp. My mom heard where he was, left Paris, and went and literally fished him out and took him to Marseille. And at that point, we want to talk about a more than my parents' issue. How many of you remember this exhibit at JCC a few years back? How many of you know who Varian Fry was? Is that a name that's familiar? Varian Fry, to work backwards, was the first American to be declared righteous by the Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. What happened? Varian Fry was not Jewish. He had grown up in Connecticut, and he was in New York doing one thing or another. One branch of the Socialist Party called New Beginnings, which my dad was a member of, put together an emergency rescue committee. And they convinced Eleanor Roosevelt to give them 200 special visas. And they sent Fry to Marseille. You know where Marseille is, down on the coast, to work specifically to get out Jewish intellectuals from Europe. That was his mandate. Over the next 2 years, Fry got out people like Hannah Arendt, André Breton, Marc Chagall, lots of names. My parents had an in with him because his deputy was a man that Dad had gone to school with in Berlin. It's funny how all these connections happen. And therefore, they became part of Fry's list. Fry was given 200 visas. He ultimately got nearly 2,000 people out by literally begging and borrowing visas from wherever he could, and sometimes sneaking people out without having visas to get them out. You know, Barbara talked about the State Department. This is one of our touch points. The State Department disliked Fry and his operation tremendously. Why? Because they were trying to keep a neutrality. We weren't in the war yet, and they were trying to keep a neutrality with the occupation authorities. And Fry was a pain in the ass to them, you know, because the Germans said, why are you letting this guy do all this stuff? And he finally was forced out of Marseille in 1941 himself and came back to the U.S. But in the meantime, lots of people got out, and my parents, now I have to go back to the map for a minute. There's a town down near the bottom called Cerbère, France. Sibir is a little place on the Mediterranean where a mountain range starts into Spain. One of the problems with getting people out in those days was you never knew whether Franco, who was now in full control, was going to turn people over to the Germans or let people through. So my parents pioneered a route for Fry up through the mountains into Spain. It worked, and it was used for the next few months. They had already picked up a sponsor in the US, in DC, someone who later, you know what the Americans for Democratic Action is. One of the founding members of that had become their sponsor in the US, got them boat tickets from Lisbon and able to come to New York. So now, in late 1940, they're finally out of this mess. As a Fry followed them, you know, the next year, and everything got shut down. And when Barbara tells you about the unsympathetic State Department, I mean, which many people have called an anti-Semitic State Department under Cordell Hull, this story of Varian Fry clearly, you know, supports that. Fry, by the way, died pretty unhappy because he didn't get very much recognition for many years. Most of his recognition came posthumously. When the National Holocaust Museum opened in DC, they had a special exhibit down in the basement for Varian Fry. And I went to the opening of it because my parents had their pictures in it. And the Holocaust Museum explained that they did this thing for Fry because in the horrible story that they told, they wanted to have at least a little nugget of good. So Varian Fry became the hero of the museum with the basement exhibit. My father died I have a little more to say about their voyage, but my father died in 1999. About a month before he died, he had been ill, but they came down we lived in Virginia then, and we went to the exhibit to see their picture, and I was out of the room with my mom for a few minutes, and I came back. Dad was a professor, I'll talk a little more about that, all his life. Came down, and my dad had 20 people around them on this big map showing all the refugee routes out of Europe, and was giving a lecture 30 days before he died at age 86 about how this had all happened. My parents' voyage in the US started in New York, and Dad, like many refugees, taught at the New School, which was often called those days the University of Exiles, because it welcomed especially a lot of the German intellectuals. Our speaker last month, interestingly, the head of the cultural district, worked at the New School for 3 or 4 years as an administrator more recently, but back then that was one of the things it did. Dad was able to write and do a little bit of teaching, and my aunt and uncle lived already in New York, and shortly thereafter my maternal grandmother came over. She came over about the same time, and she also lived in New York and continued to be a governess. At some point, Dad got a job with the War Department, now Defense Department, and it's not real well known, but we trained a bunch of German prisoners of war. We brought them over to retrain them. I call them the light Nazis and the non-Nazis that they thought were savable to get ready for, it was Douglas MacArthur of Europe, getting ready to redo Germany after the end of the war. And Dad got involved in this program, and one of the places he ended up with, I think we've got it on another map, at Fort Eustis, Virginia, where one of these training camps happened. This program was featured in Life magazine back then. There was a colonel there, and the colonel after the war became president of the University of Colorado. And he invited my father to go out and become a professor of political science in Boulder, which is where I spent 14 years of my life. Later on, Dad moved to Dartmouth. Interestingly, there wasn't really much, you need to know this, there wasn't much Jewish life at all. Boulder had 7 Jewish families in it at the time, as has many more now. My parents went to the Unitarian Church for a while. I went to the Congregational Church. I married into a Jewish family, and we've been off and on members of Temple. But for them, they had, with a mother who worked every night, and a dad who'd been dead, and a father on my mom's side who was a socialist, and a mother who was not Jewish, they really were the classic assimilationist Jewish family. That we didn't know we were, my brother and I didn't know we were Jewish till we were 16, and the picture that was portrayed, which they could do, which was quite unusual, they got kicked out of Germany because they were socialists. That's not really true, but there was a much easier image for them to handle because they had made the choice to be socialists than to recognize that they really had been kicked out of Europe the same reason that every other Jew, which was their background, and they didn't even know most traditions in Judaism because it had never been passed on to them. But they had a very good life in the US, and unlike some German and other Jews who were bitter and would not want to go back, they went to Europe all the time, in Germany and France later. And Dad died in '94, Mom in 2002, and as I say, they had a very full life. But I always thought that my dad went to Colorado, out in the mountains. He loved the mountains, in a quieter place, because the life before had been so heavy that they needed someplace quieter. He could have gone to an Ivy League college. He was pretty well known in political science. He chose to, much later in life when he went to Dartmouth, not to do that because it had just been too much. David, could you come up and tell a more direct story about arrivals in Pittsburgh, please? Hold it to you. Hold it up.
I arrived in Pittsburgh actually in 1992, but I'll just spend a few brief moments talking about my family's arrival in the United States. My mother came from Breslau in Germany, where Michael had relatives. So for several generations, her family had lived in Breslau, where my mother grew up with her two siblings. When she was in high school, she met a pen pal in England, and she kept in touch with this pen pal throughout high school. So when her family was forced to leave Germany in 1939, her family couldn't gain entry into any place except England, because the pen pal made arrangements for her family to settle in England. The family that settled my mother's family in England they were heirs to the Cadbury Chocolate Company, and they had the financial resources to sign affidavits of financial support to allow her family to settle in England. However, my grandfather couldn't leave Germany and died in the Holocaust, but my mother, her brother, and her sister and her mother settled in England, in Birmingham, which is the Pittsburgh of England.
Yes, it is.
It was interesting that my grandmother and my aunt opened a fish and chips shop in Birmingham that got to be very successful. What else would two German Jewish women do in England? My father grew up in Potsdam, Germany, which is outside of Berlin. It was the home of Frederick the Great, and so for several generations, the family had a shoe store in Potsdam. It was like the little shoes of Potsdam. But the family was forced to flee Germany. My father came to the United States in 1939. He had relatives in Chattanooga, Tennessee, who signed an affidavit of financial support to enable him to enter the U.S. And he ultimately joined the U.S. Army and was sent over to Italy, where he fought. He was wounded and he came back to the U.S. and settled in Washington, D.C. My mother, she arrived in England in 1939, stayed there throughout the war, and then met up with my father in 1946 right outside of Washington, D.C., where where our family grew up. So that's a summary of my family's history.
Thank you.
Very nice.
Wanderings is definitely the name of this talk. Questions to any of the three of us, please.
David, you said you arrived in Pittsburgh in 1999.
1992.
Okay, so all this time you were living outside of Washington, D.C. before you came to Pittsburgh, is that correct?
I spent the first 18 years of my life in Washington, D.C., but then I went to school in New York State and did graduate work in Chicago and lived in several other cities until I came to Pittsburgh in 1992.
Other questions? Yes.
How did your folks master English coming over from Europe, and your father becoming a professor right away?
New school was important. Having my aunt and uncle already know some English was important. But I have a funny story. My parents decided to try to teach me English. I came along the first year after they got here, so they decided to teach me English. My aunt and uncle had two girls in Flushing, Queens. They taught their girls German. Figured they'd learn English on the street. So I learned. So I learned English. And I'm in second grade, and my parents are called into school, and they're told, "We think your son has a speech defect." And it turns out that I never to this day can pronounce TH correctly because I learned English that way from my mom.
My mother-in-law from Hungary never could say TH correctly.
Oh, that's right.
David, do you remember language issues?
My parents learned English in high school in Germany. Being German Jews, they were fairly well educated. They went to the gymnasium. Their brethren in Eastern Europe typically didn't learn English in school, but my parents did. Interestingly, they spoke with a very heavy German accent, whereas immigrants from Eastern Europe who didn't know English, didn't learn English in school, learned English in the US and generally spoke without much of an accent.
Yeah.
Don't feel bad, because most Americans don't speak English either.
Thank you. I'll pay you later. other.
You know, one of the interesting sagas of this German refugees are any number. I mentioned that you had special dispensation if you were a professor or scholar. And a number of German Jewish professors who spoke English wound up in the South in black colleges. And in fact, there was a film that was made of this, but it was a fascinating experience for them and for their black students, because here, you know, these black young men had been feeling the ravages of prejudice, and then they are taught by these German Jews who you would think would have no relationship, but they bonded so strongly, and it's really a fascinating story about the numbers of German Jewish professors who wound up in the South. Question on
When
that?
did the State Department set special regulations or processes for refugees as opposed to just general immigrants?
That's not till way after World War II.
No.
Okay, I mean, even the State Department, and we didn't talk about it, but the State Department, this no vacancy sign in America, outside America, really continued even after the war. The Displaced Persons Act, it was suggested that we take there were about 1 million displaced persons, people who didn't want to or couldn't go back to their homes after World War II, including several 100,000 Jews. And the Displaced Persons Act that was passed in 1948 made specific demands that 40% of the refugees should be from the Baltic countries, okay? Not Jews necessarily, and in fact they discriminated against Jews. The cutoff date to even be considered for immigration to the United States was in December 45, and most of the Jews, at least 150,000 to 200,000 who lived, were those who had fled to the Soviet Union during the war. And even though their lives were miserable, they were not deliberately targeted in the Soviet Union the way they were under German occupation. But these people were not released until after December 1945. So to be considered under the Displaced Persons Act to come to the United States, they deliberately set the cutoff date at December 45 before these 200,000 Jews were released from Russia. They had preference for the Baltic refugees. Does anybody know why they might have preferred the Baltic immigrants, why they specified those? Anybody have any clue? They were anti-communists.
Oh, right.
Okay, because most of them had fled from the Nazis because they were fled from the Russians who were now occupying the Baltic nations because they had collaborated with the Nazis. So they fled into the DP camps, but we didn't care about that. We just cared about, and this is Congress, just cared that they were anti-communists in the Cold War era. So the State Department's attitude, the congressional attitude continues after World War II, and it really is until Lyndon Johnson in the 60s where you begin to get this provision for refugees, and clearly by 1980 there's strong legislation permitting refugees as opposed to just immigrants. And I think today, actually I'm not sure, we have special, I think 50,000, I'm not sure about today how many refugees we can allow in, but this is of course a question today.
Could I?
Barbara talked about Houston. I'll get you in a minute. Barbara talked about Lyndon Johnson. The Houston Jewish Holocaust Museum has an annual dinner. It's named after Lyndon Johnson because of his generosity to the German kids.
Yeah, we shouldn't forget that there was a long history of anti-Semitism in Europe. After all, Moses Mendelssohn, who was a famous Jewish scholar, decided that his son Felix should convert because otherwise he would not have had his music abilities even recognized, let alone developed. Although Felix did in later life have some Jewish themes in his music. That was not unusual. It was very common. And of course, we all know about Sigmund Freud, who was the smartest guy in every place he went, but couldn't get an appointment to any university because he was Jewish. And so this is old stuff.
My uncle on the husband of my mother's sister did a lot of genealogy.
Mm-hmm.
He found in their line and his line, two separate lines, Sigmund Freud in both of them.
I was going to tell you.
Let me just also point out that Albert Einstein, of course,
Yeah.
was thrown out of Germany. And another whole topic that we didn't even get into were all these German refugees who came to the United States and enriched the United States in so many ways. But you mentioned anti-Semitism in Europe. One of the things that shocks my students is the extent of anti-Semitism in America. In the 1930s, you had a lot of people out there, Father Coughlin, and you had all kinds of groups that were spewing anti-Semitism. And in fact, I got, doing some research in the library at University of Pittsburgh, the Jewish Community Relations Council started collecting some of the propaganda that was distributed here in Pittsburgh, and I show it in classes, and it's really shocking to recognize what was going on in Pittsburgh on the north side. A German-American Bund chapter on the north side was operating, and the Bund was financed and sent literature from Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda from Germany. The stuff was coming right into this country, into Pittsburgh, and distributed on our streets, and it was free press. So you mentioned anti-Semitism in Europe. Let's not ignore the fact that there was a lot in America too.
You had I'll get
Yes.
both of you.
I was just gonna tell you, that picture of the man you showed, Vax, is that his name?
Fry, very
Yes,
Fry.
Fry, excuse me. This was years ago, it was either on the History Channel or Channel 13. There was a whole story about he and his wife, and they kept going back to Europe to help the Jews and get papers and everything, and eventually, you know, she wanted to have a family back in the States, and eventually she didn't want to go to Europe. So he started going by himself, and I think they eventually divorced because he kept going back to Europe to help. But it was it was like a documentary or something, and it was either on the History Channel or Channel 13.
Apparently he went to Berlin in *35, was so upset by what he saw beginning to happen that made him willing to be hired by the Emergency Rescue Committee to probably do that and probably kill his marriage. Flo?
When you talk about anti-Semitism in the 1930s, if you look on the Ellis Island website, people are identified as Hebrew by the American government, and Ellis Island closed in like 1924. My family are identified as Magyar, no, it's Hungarian Hebrew. And if you are truly Hungarian, and this was the American government, you were identified as Hungarian Magyar. So this started way back.
Barbara mentioned the Bund's impact in Pittsburgh. Some of you may be aware that the Bund and its headquarters in New York and Washington probably had a lot to do with delaying the U.S. entrance into World War II. They kept pressure on not to do it for a long time. Anything else? I want to end my thing this way. I talked about my parents not really knowing about their Judaism and not ever really coming back to it the way I did. Despite that, my grandmother, my paternal grandmother, who died finally in about 1989 after a long life in New York, when she got sick and needed to go to a nursing home, she went to the Jewish Home for the Aged. I never quite understood how that all happened, but that's where I was in high school, I was worrying about other things, but that's how it happened. So there was, back in the recesses, there was the understanding, you know, that this is where it all started. We have this tradition. Please take chairs over there. I need an able-bodied man or two in about 10 minutes to help Audrey take some equipment down the stairs. Think about joining tonight. Think about buying some books. Think about eating some cookies in the back. I will see you all in March. Happy holidays to everyone.